To be very devout is to be someone who has a kind of very demonstrable attachment to their faith, right? That's the sense of being devout. Why would that matter?
Maybe because people understand that every measure that you take is for their own good, and that they should not question your decisions.
But that would also be true, for example, if you were trustworthy or something, right? Because you're like, trust me, okay, this guy knows what he's doing, and so on. But why should devotion matter, right? I mean, look, you could be to be devout doesn't necessarily say that you're intelligent or you're skillful or anything, right? It just simply says you have a kind of strong attachment to the church and the faith that it represents. Yeah.
Isn't it because perhaps you have like a special connection up there?
With the big guy upstairs? Possibly. You want to that's important to stress, that's true. That's part of it, but I think there's something else.
Because the church was the one who had money.
Church does have money, but if you think about it, it's a kind of outsourcing, isn't it? It's a form of outsourcing. It's a form of efficiency. Because if you're extremely devout, it's like a kind of, I might even go so far as to say it's a form of brand extension. What are you leveraging as part of your own personal brand if you're extremely devout? You're leveraging what? The power of the church, right? There's an entire ecclesiological artifice that attaches to you through your devotion. So if you show yourself as tremendously devoted to the church, then you're bringing with you the whole image that the church represents, the idea of piety and the true path and eternal salvation and all that kind of stuff. And so it's an efficient way to leverage all of those things as part of your own brand of rule, your own brand of power. It's a form of powerful, efficient, outsourced association that then links back to you. And so all the other things are important, but devotion is particularly important because that way you're leveraging an existing institutional product, social product, in ways that help your own image, right? He says, "It is most necessary of all to seem devout. In these matters, most men judge more by their eyes than by their hands. If everyone is capable of seeing you, but few can touch you." So in other words, if they see that you're very devoted to the church, what are they going to think? They're going to take all of the things they think about the church, right, as being the institution responsible for the salvation of the soul, and they're going to write that onto you. And who was the person one of the rulers that Machiavelli admired a great deal? We already mentioned it, is Ferdinand the Catholic, who was an example of this, and I'll point to what he says about Fernando. Chapter 21, he says, "Nothing enables a ruler to gain more prestige than undertaking great campaigns and performing unusual deeds. In our own times, Ferdinand of Aragon, the present king of Spain, is a notable example. He's become the most famous and glorious king in Christendom," and so on and so forth. And he talks about the reconquest of Iberia and so on, which he then argues was not undertaken as some kind of devout desire to liberate Spain or re-Christianize Spain and free it from the subjugation of a foreign faith, but instead as part of his own strategy of power acquisition. He says further on, after considering the campaign against the Moors, he says, "Moreover, in order to undertake even greater campaigns, Ferdinand continued to make use of religion, resorting to a cruel and apparently pious policy of unexampled wretchedness, that of hunting down the Moors and driving them out of his kingdom." He exercised great cruelty against the Moors who were living in Spain, and the purpose of that was to use that cruelty to demonstrate what? His unfailing devotion to his faith, and to make a public demonstration of his piety. If you go back then to what he says, "Men believe what they can see, they can't see you. Men judge by their eyes than by their hands." So it's a good example of making your faith visible. For Machiavelli, and we can disagree, but for Machiavelli perspective, Ferdinand of Aragon was a good prince because he provides a blueprint for how to achieve power, and the vehicle for achieving that power was an apparent devotion to a religious idea, and then driving a kind of cruel campaign against the Moor to reinforce the power of that idea. And so therefore, he says, "If ruler then contrives to conquer and to preserve the state, the means will always be judged to be honorable and to be praised by everybody. If you cultivate these characteristics, even though they are not sincere, you will nonetheless be judged honorable by those over whom you rule, because the standard by which they will judge you is going to be the outcome, namely a stable society." If a ruler contrives to conquer and to preserve the state, that's the key word, to preserve the state, meaning to keep it in a state of order, the means will always be judged honorable by those who live under it, because they are judging as a consequence of the ends. And so the result, therefore, is that in this context of is it better to be feared than loved, the answer is you should be feared, but you don't want to go too far to fall into hatred, and so therefore the cunning ruler, the ruler who is thinking not only as a lion but also as a fox, will think carefully about the kind of image that they want to craft for themselves, and as an act of almost breathtaking insincerity, try to cultivate an image that redounds, in fact, to the exact opposite, to their sincerity. Public sincerity and private insincerity, essentially you might say, is Machiavelli's kind of key idea. Finally, before we finish our question of Machiavelli, let's ask then this question, is there a political theory lurking in all this? Because what we've seen so far sounds like a set of strategies, attributes, excellences, we might say elements within us that we should cultivate in order to climb to the top. So we could read this book simply as a blueprint for how to acquire and hold on to power that could apply in lots of different circumstances, which is why I think CEOs and other aspiring executives like to read the print so that they become more Machiavellian and defeat their enemies. Is that how we should read this book? Do you think that we should read this book simply as a blueprint for how to hold on to power? Because that's not really a political theory, is it? That's simply a kind of cookbook for how to become more powerful than you are today. And I think some people will only read it in that way. Is there a way to rescue this text then from that kind of reductivist how-to manual approach of power? That's not easy, I gotta say, because Machiavelli is so unflinching in the recommendations that he provides to us about the nature of power. This idea of we should be cruel, we should lie, we should be willing to take whatever means are necessary in order to hold on to power. What then would be the political theory that Machiavelli might want us to focus on? And I think it comes from that word that we just saw, the notion of preserve, right? To preserve the state, that the ruler who is successful and preserves the state is one who will be judged honorable and successful by the men over whom he rules. What does it mean to preserve the state? What's locked into that idea of preserve? It goes back to some of the things that Machiavelli is telling us before. What's the one thing you don't do as part of your policy of fear? What do you not touch? You can kill a man's father, but don't take away his property, right? There's a certain idea of respect that seems to be built into Machiavelli's thinking that honors, if you will, the individual inside of a society. It is not acceptable to practice random cruelty against people simply for the sake of terrorizing men. That the purpose of rule is not simply your own self-aggrandizement, because that's not going to be consistent with your ability to hold on to power. Power is held onto when you implement policies that not serve your own immediate ends, like, huge palaces and the like, but instead serve to preserve the state. If we seize upon that, and I'm not saying that this is the only reading permissible of Machiavelli, or even necessarily the best reading of Machiavelli, but we might then be able to squeeze out, to sort of rescue Machiavelli from his otherwise amoral reductivism, to argue that he's not simply telling us that we should pursue a set of strategies, the purpose of which is power for its own sake, collected in the hands of those who are clever. But that power serves another end. Power is there for another reason. It has a larger purpose. And that larger purpose is then perhaps this idea to preserve the state. And he says, for example, that it is important that you act in a way that allows people to pursue their own lives. Oh yes, page 79, right at the end. He says, it's in chapter 21, how a ruler should act in order to gain reputation. In fact, it's in the same chapter that he talks about Fernando. He says, a ruler should also show himself a lover of talent and honor those who excel in any art. Moreover, he should encourage the citizens to follow quietly their ordinary occupations, both in trade and agriculture and every other kind, so that one man is not afraid to improve or increase his possessions for fear that they will be taken from him, and another does not hesitate to begin to trade for fear of the taxes that will be levied. What does he mean by that? What's implied in that argument? That you should let people do what leave them alone, allow them to follow quietly what they do, so that they will feel confident and therefore seek to improve what they have, seek to engage in the activity that they want to engage in, without fear that their improvements or that their wealth will be confiscated. That, at least as I read it, is a kind of basic articulation of a kind of property rights centric view of the state. What people have belongs to them. And the goal of the state is to allow people to live in a context of security with what they have. And so a good ruler is a ruler who nurtures or cultivates his talents in such a way so as to let that happen. A state will be better when people seek to improve their own condition, when they seek to engage in trade and commerce, when they seek to improve their own prosperity. In other words, when they seek to preserve the state by following quietly their own trade or occupation, that all of that will make a better state than one that instead randomly terrorizes or otherwise confiscates the wealth or property of the people who live within it. If this is the higher end, then, of rule, in other words, if the purpose of power is to build a system, the fundamental goal of which is to respect the property rights of the people who live within it, suddenly now it doesn't sound quite so dramatically amoral and reductivist, because in fact that's very consistent with the kind of world that we ourselves are used to, right? The whole purpose of our existing constitutional system is to safeguard individual liberties, where we tend to equate liberty with property rights. So it's a kind of proto-Lockean argument in a way, if you accept that reading of Machiavelli. It's true, I've cherry-picked one sentence out of the entire text, or maybe two sentences, in order to justify that reading of Machiavelli. But it does seem to be his preoccupation, because he does mention at various points that it's important to maintain the stability of the state. And the purpose of the stability of the state is not simply to protect the ruler from rebellion, but also to allow the people within the state to thrive. That seems to be the goal. And so it seems then we can argue that if there is a political theory to Machiavelli, it's essentially built around the idea that sort of political models, built out of a kind of idealism, because they don't actually reflect who people really are, don't work, and therefore are actually harmful to the people that they affect, because they're building up a model of political power that doesn't actually exist in the real world. Instead, in order to give people what they want and need, namely stability, you therefore have to take as your starting point the recognition of who people are as they are. And from there, from that somewhat, say, diminishing point of view, people are both people and animals. Therefore, rulers need to both use law and force, etc. Right? From that kind of rather dark point of view of humanity, actually you then end up in a much better place than if your departure point is all people want to be good Christians and achieve eternal divine reward, and therefore we should construct a model of power that honors that soteriological desire that people have. That's the image that Machiavelli wants us to reject. And so if we're left with any takeaway, one of the reasons why this text serves as a kind of hinge in our Western political thinking is it moves us away from a reading of politics built, as I mentioned at the very beginning of our lecture last time, a vision of politics built around the idea of a Christian fellowship or a Christian community, and instead asks us to think of ourselves and think of our own political citizenship in a non-Christian, or if you will, in a secular context, in a non-transcendental way. That we have, therefore, to understand politics, if we want to get it right, without making appeal to some sort of transcendental desire that may rest within our devout souls, and instead form a politics that's based on the world in the here and now. I mention this as a concluding remark because when we come back tomorrow, and you've all read at least a few pages of your Hobbes, right? Just please read it. The reason I bring it up, and what we're going to look at tomorrow, is that when Hobbes comes along in the Leviathan, and for the first time in modern history sets out a very carefully reasoned argument for how we should think about constructing political society, the first thing he has to do is at great length dismantle a previous thought structure that explains how we have seen ourselves as political. And as we'll see when we come to Hobbes tomorrow, that exercise is in some ways anticipated by the political project that Machiavelli sets out for us here in The Prince. Okay, thank you very much. I will see you guys tomorrow when we'll pick up our discussion on Hobbes.